Long before the first word was ever spoken, before meaning could be shaped into sound, before thought could be carried from one mind to another through language, there was silence. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of a world that had never learned to speak. In that distant time, humans walked beneath the same sky we know today, felt the same cold wind on their skin, watched the same sun rise and fall, but they did so without names, without stories. Without words to explain what they were feeling, or where they were going, or who they were becoming. There was no before and no after as we understand it now. There was only presence, only the moment unfolding, endlessly renewed. This is the time we will enter now, a time when humans had no language. They did not greet one another. They did not ask questions. They did not tell stories by the fire, yet they lived, they loved, they feared, they survived. For hundreds of thousands of years, this silent humanity endured. Imagine waking at dawn in that world, your eyes open to pale light spreading across the land. You do not think it is morning. You do not name the color of the sky or the chill in the air. Your body simply rises, responding to light and cold the way it always has. Around you, others stir. No one speaks. There is no word for sleep, no word for wake. Movement itself is the signal. A glance is enough, a shift of posture. A subtle tension in the shoulders. Meaning does not arrive through sound, it arrives through attention. In this world, to survive is to notice. Every sound matters because none are wasted on speech. The crack of a branch, the breath of wind through grass, the distant call of an animal, the rhythm of footsteps nearby. Silence sharpens perception. Without language to dull it, the senses are wide open. The eyes learn patterns before the mind does. The body remembers paths long before memory becomes a story. Knowledge lives in movement. A child watches an elder strike stone against stone. There is no explanation, no instruction, only repetition. Hands move, stone chips away. The child watches again and again. And slowly, without a word ever spoken, understanding forms. This is how tools are learned, how fire is tended, how shelter is built. Nothing is described, everything is demonstrated. In this silent world, teaching is patience, learning is imitation. Wisdom is carried not in speech, but in muscle and bone. There is no word for mother, yet the bond exists. An infant cries not with meaning, but with instinct. The sound is not a message. It is a signal of need, raw and unshaped. The adult responds without thinking. There is no internal sentence forming, no decision spoken inside the mind. Care happens automatically. Emotion flows directly into action. Without language, there is no distance between feeling and response. Fear does not say its name. It tightens the body, speeds the heart, sharpens the senses. Joy does not announce itself. It spreads warmth through the chest, loosens the muscles, pulls bodies closer together. Grief is not narrated. It is carried in posture, in stillness, in the absence of movement. The mind in this time does not speak to itself. There is no inner monologue whispering judgments or plans, no voice rehearsing the past or imagining the future. Thought exists, but it is not verbal. Images arise. Sensations guide action. Memory is felt, not told. A place remembered is not described, it is recognized. A danger remembered is not named, it is avoided. Time itself feels different here. Without language, there are no calendars, no histories, no stories stretching backward or forward. Life unfolds in cycles, light and dark, hunger and fullness, movement and rest. The past does not replay itself as narrative. The future does not demand planning in words. There is only rhythm. Days pass without being counted. Years pass without being known. Generations rise and fall without recording their existence. And yet nothing is lost to those who live this way, because nothing has ever been owned. In the absence of language, identity is not constructed. There is no name to defend, no reputation to protect, no story to uphold. A human is not someone. A human is simply here. Group life in this world is quiet but deeply connected. Without speech, social bonds rely on constant awareness. A shift in mood is felt immediately. A tension spreads through the group like a change in weather. Conflict does not escalate through argument. It resolves through distance, through gesture, through action. There is no blame spoken aloud, no justification offered. If someone leaves, they leave. If someone returns, they return. Belonging is not explained, it is sensed, and silence does not mean emptiness. At night, when the fire glows low, bodies gather close. The crackling of embers fills the space where words will one day live. Faces flicker in orange light, eyes meet, expressions shift. A shared hum might rise, not a song, not language, just sound. Rhythm without meaning, connection without symbols. This may be where language begins to stir, faintly unnoticed, but for now sound remains unshaped. In this world, death arrives without explanation. There is no word for gone, no ritual spoken aloud, no story told to make sense of loss. A body that once moved no longer does. The group responds not with questions, but with stillness. Absence is felt physically like a missing warmth. Grief does not ask why, it simply is, and then life continues because it must. Without language, there is no rebellion against reality, no argument with fate, no attempt to explain the unexplainable. The world is accepted as it appears. This is not ignorance, it is intimacy. Humans in this time are not separate from their environment. Do not stand apart and describe it. They move within it, inseparable from it. The forest is not a concept, it is a presence. The sky is not an object, it is movement and light and shadow. Animals are not categorized, they are known individually by behavior and pattern. To see is to understand, to survive is to belong. And yet, slowly, very slowly, something begins to change. Tiny sounds start to repeat. A breath shaped the same way again and again. A rhythm shared between two minds. No one notices it happening. There is no moment when language is invented. There is only a gradual shift, like dawn arriving without announcement. A sound begins to mean something not in thought but in response. A call that draws attention, a tone that signals danger, a pattern that invites closeness. Meaning begins to cling to sound, but this is still far away. For now, humanity remains silent, living fully, feeling deeply, remembering without words. This is where our story begins. The first sounds that began to matter were not words, they were not chosen, they were not designed. They emerged the way breath fogs in cold air naturally without intention. A sharp intake of air when danger appeared, a low hum when the body felt calm. A sudden cry when pain arrived. These sounds had always existed, but now something new was happening. They were starting to repeat, and repetition is the doorway to meaning. When one human heard another make a sound and saw what followed, the mind began to connect the two. A sound and a moment, a tone and a feeling, a breath and an action, not yet language, but something close to it. In a world without words, even the smallest pattern can become a bridge between minds. Imagine a group moving through tall grass. A predator stirs nearby. One human senses it first, not through thought, but through a subtle shift in the wind, a faint vibration in the ground. The body tenses. The breath catches, a sound escapes, not a word, just a sharp, instinctive exhale. But others hear it, and their bodies tense too. The sound has carried something, not an idea, not a sentence, but a shared state of being. Alertness spreads. This is how the first shared meanings were born. They did not describe the world, they pointed to it. A low tone might become the sound of safety. A high tone, the sound of danger. A repeated rhythm, the sound of gathering together. Slowly, the human nervous system learned that sound could travel faster than sight. Sound could warn before teeth appeared. Sound could call before hands could reach. In this quiet world, sound became a new sense, and with it came a subtle shift in the human mind. The brain began to hold not just images and sensations, but associations between sounds and experiences. Memory started to change. Before, a dangerous place was remembered as a feeling in the body. Now it could be remembered as a sound. Before, a familiar person was known by face and movement. Now they could be recognized by the way they made noise. This did something extraordinary. It allowed humans to carry experiences with them, not only in their muscles and instincts, but in patterns of sound. The world was becoming portable. A warning no longer had to be felt directly. It could be heard from a distance. A need no longer had to be seen. It could be signaled. Slowly, quietly, without anyone noticing, the human mind was beginning to step outside the present moment, because sound could travel into the future. A call made now could change what happened next. This was new. Before, everything happened when it happened. Now sound could shape what was about to happen. A small opening in time had appeared, and in that opening language would one day grow, but for now it was still fragile. These sounds were not stable. They changed from person to person, from group to group. They faded and returned. Meaning was fluid. A sound that meant safety in one moment could mean nothing in the next, yet the direction was set. The human mind was discovering that reality could be pointed to, not just lived. This discovery began to reshape how humans related to each other. Before, connection required physical closeness. Now a sound could pull someone near. Before, emotion had to be seen. Now it could be heard. A cry of distress brought help. A soft hum brought calm. The invisible had found a way to travel, and with it something new began to stir inside the human brain, an echo. A sound heard did not vanish immediately. It lingered. The mind began to replay it, not as a thought, not as a word, but as a faint memory of sound. This was the beginning of inner experience as something separate from the outside world, a quiet revolution. For the first time, something could exist inside the mind that was not happening outside. A sound could be remembered, and memory could be summoned. This is where the long road toward inner speech began, but for now the inner world was still mostly silent. The human brain was not yet narrating its own existence. It was only starting to hum. These early sound patterns were not used to describe objects. They were used to describe states: danger, calm, pain, togetherness. They did not say tree or water or fire. They said something closer: to be careful, come close, something is wrong, everything is safe. But even these are too much like modern language. In truth, they were more like emotional weather. A sound was not a message, it was a mood, and moods spread. When one person hummed, others relaxed. When one cried out, others became alert. This emotional synchronization made groups stronger. They could move as one, feel as one, react as one, without needing to explain anything. This made early humans deeply attuned to one another. A small shift in tone could change the behavior of the whole group. In a way, they were more connected than we are today because they had nothing to hide behind, no words to deceive, no stories to manipulate. Sound revealed the body's truth, and the body listened. As generations passed, these sound patterns became more reliable. Certain tones were used again and again in the same situations. Soft rising sound when offering food, a sharp bark when warning of danger, a rhythmic hum when gathering at night. The sounds became predictable, and predictability creates structure. Structure creates meaning. Meaning creates memory. Memory creates culture. The first threads of culture were being woven not with words but with sound. Children learned these sounds the way they learned everything else, by watching and copying. A baby would cry. An adult would respond with a calming tone. The baby would feel safe. Soon the baby would make that same tone to feel safe, not because it meant safe, but because it felt safe. The The sound and the feeling became one. This is how the first symbolic associations were formed, not consciously, not intentionally, but inevitably. Sound was becoming a bridge between inner and outer worlds, between one mind and another. And slowly, something profound began to happen. Humans began to expect sound. When silence stretched too long, something felt wrong. When a familiar hum was absent, anxiety arose. Sound had become part of social reality. The world was no longer only what was seen and touched, it was also what was heard. This changed how humans experienced loneliness. Before, being alone was simply being alone. Now it was the absence of sound, the absence of shared rhythm. Silence became something that could be felt as a lack, and in that lack, longing was born. Longing is one of the first emotions that requires memory and expectation. To long is to feel the present as incomplete. Sound made that possible because sound connected moments. A call now could bring someone later, a hum remembered could be missed. The future had entered the human heart, yet still there were no words, no stories, no names, just sound, emotion, and the growing web between them. The mind was changing, but it was not yet speaking. It was listening, listening to itself, listening to others, listening to the echoes of what had been felt before. And as these echoes grew stronger, they began to shape the inner world. A human might hear a warning sound even when no one made it, not as a hallucination, but as a memory rising to guide behavior. This was the first whisper of internal guidance, not language, but something that would one day become it. The silence of the old world was slowly filling, not with noise, but with meaning, and that meaning was no longer bound to the present moment. It could be carried, it could be remembered, it could be shared. This was the beginning of a new kind of humanity, one that would one day speak, but for now it still mostly listened. As sound slowly settled into human life, something else began to shift just as quietly. The mind started to wait for it. Where once a sudden cry or soft hum had been an accidental release of emotion, it now became something expected. The body began to anticipate sound the way it anticipated light at dawn or hunger at dusk. This anticipation marked a turning point. For the first time, humans were not only reacting to the world as it happened, they were preparing for what might come next. And preparation is the seed of thought. A low tone might drift through the group in the evening, not because danger was present, but because closeness was desired. A rising sound might be made when food was found, not because hunger was felt, but because sharing was intended. Slowly, sound was moving from instinct to intention. This was a delicate moment in human history. Sound was no longer just a reflection of the body's state. It was becoming a tool, not a tool of control, not a tool of manipulation, but a tool of connection. To make a sound now was to reach outward, to invite a response. To be heard was to be acknowledged. In this way, the first invisible threads of communication were being woven between minds. When one human made a familiar tone, others responded with a matching state of being. They did not think about it. Their bodies knew what to do. The nervous systems of the group began to move together, synchronizing through sound. This synchronization created a feeling of unity that went deeper than physical proximity. A group that moved in rhythm survived better. They could hunt together, they could flee together, they could rest together. Sound gave them this rhythm, and rhythm is the ancestor of language. In the evenings, when the work of the day was done and the fire glowed softly, humans gathered. They did not tell stories. They did not explain their experiences, but they shared something just as powerful. They shared sound. A low, gentle hum might rise from one chest, then another. Soon the whole group might be breathing and vocalizing together, a slow, steady vibration filling the dark. This was not music, it was not speech, it was shared being. In this shared sound, the group felt safe, heartbeats slowed, muscles relaxed, eyes softened. The hum did not mean anything, and yet it meant everything. It said, "Without words, we are here together." This was the emotional foundation upon which language would one day be built, because before you can speak, you must first feel that someone is listening. Children born into this world grew up surrounded by these sounds. They did not hear conversations, they heard moods. They did not hear stories, they heard states of being. Their brains were shaped by this. The neural pathways that would one day handle language were being quietly prepared, not by words but by patterns. Patterns of tone, patterns of rhythm, patterns of response. A child learned that a certain sound brought food, another brought comfort, another meant danger. They did not think about these connections, they lived them. And living something is the strongest form of learning. As the generations passed, these sound patterns became more refined. They were still simple, still tied closely to emotion and action, but they were becoming more distinct. A sound for gathering, a sound for warning, a sound for calming. Each group developed its own variations, shaped by environment and experience. The sounds of a group that lived near the sea differed from those who lived in forests or plains. Wind, water, animals, and landscape all influenced how humans used their voices. In this way, the first proto-cultures were born, not in words but in sounds. Two groups meeting for the first time would immediately hear these differences. Their tones would not quite match, their rhythms would not align. A sense of strangeness would arise, not because of ideas, not because of beliefs, but because of sound. This was the beginning of identity. Long before humans could say we and they could hear it. And yet something else was happening inside the human mind. As sound patterns became more stable, the brain began to treat them as objects. Not physical objects, but mental ones. A familiar sound could be recognized even when it was not present. It could be imagined. It could be anticipated. This was new. For the first time, humans could hold something in their minds that was not currently happening in the world. A tone could be remembered. A rhythm could be expected. This created a small space inside consciousness, a space between sensation and response. In that space, something like thought began to form, not words, not concepts, but quiet representations. A human might pause, hearing a faint rustle, and the memory of a warning sound would rise inside them. Their body would tense before any actual sound was made. The memory of sound had become a guide. This was the birth of internal signaling. The mind was learning to speak to itself, not in language, but in echoes, an inner hum, an inner warning, an inner call. This is the earliest form of what we now call thinking. It was not verbal. It was not analytical. It was intuitive, emotional, and deeply tied to survival, but it was internal. The human mind had taken a small step inward. This inward step changed everything. Before, all guidance came from the outside world. Now some of it came from within. Memory and imagination began to merge. A human could imagine a danger before it appeared. A human could imagine a comfort before it was given. The future, in a faint way, had begun to exist. This changed how humans related to time. They still lived mostly in the present, but the present was now surrounded by a halo of remembered sounds and anticipated tones. The moment was no longer alone. This is where anxiety was born, not the complex anxiety of modern humans, but a simple unease, the feeling that something might happen. This feeling was tied to imagined sounds, a danger tone remembered, a cry of pain recalled, a call for help anticipated. The mind was learning to simulate. And simulation is the ancestor of planning, but all of this was still happening without words. There was no inner voice saying, "Be careful." There was only a faint echo of a sound once heard. The body responded to that echo as if it were real. This made humans more adaptable, more cautious, more prepared. It also made them more complex. Inside each person, a quiet inner landscape was forming, a place where sounds could exist without being made, a place where the world could be replayed and reshaped. This inner world was private, no one else could hear it. For the first time, each human was becoming a little more separate. Before, everything was shared through direct experience. Now something could exist inside one mind that did not exist in another. This was the beginning of individuality as we know it, not through names, not through stories, but through inner experience. And yet the group remained deeply connected through sound. The outer world was still a shared rhythm. The inner world was beginning to hum quietly on its own. These two worlds, outer and inner, were slowly drifting apart. Language would one day bridge them, but for now the bridge was still only a few tones wide. As the inner world of sound continued to grow, it began to influence the outer one in subtle ways. Humans were no longer only responding to what they sensed, they were responding to what they remembered, to what they expected, to what they quietly imagined. This meant that two people standing in the same place might not feel the same thing anymore. One might sense danger because an old warning sound echoed faintly inside. Another might feel calm because a soothing tone was remembered instead. The shared world was starting to fragment into many inner worlds. This was the true beginning of the human mind, not the brain, which had always existed, but the experience of having something inside that was not directly happening outside. With this new inner space came a new kind of loneliness. Even when surrounded by others, a human could now feel isolated, caught inside their own remembered sounds and emotional echoes. The group still moved together, still hummed together, still warned each other with cries and calls, but beneath that shared rhythm, each person carried a slightly different inner music. This difference created the first misunderstandings. A warning sound might be made, but another might not feel its urgency. A calming hum might be offered, but someone else might not feel soothed. Without words to clarify, these differences remained invisible. This tension pushed sound to become more precise, not by design, but by necessity. If a tone did not reliably produce the desired response, it changed. If a warning did not make others alert, it became sharper. If a call for closeness did not bring others near, it became warmer. Over generations, sounds were slowly shaped by social feedback. This is how proto-words began to form, not as labels for objects, but as tools for shaping behavior. A sound became something you used, not just something that happened, and when something is used, it becomes intentional. Intention is the soul of language. Now imagine a group of early humans near a river, a flash of movement in the water, a predator perhaps. One person lets out a sharp, rising cry. Others immediately freeze. The sound has done its job. But suppose one day a person makes that sound by mistake. The group freezes, but nothing happens. The sound loses a bit of its power. Over time, the group learns to associate that sound not just with fear, but with the one who made it. Trust enters the picture. Who made the sound? When did they make it? How often is it reliable? These subtle evaluations are happening without conscious thought, but they are happening. Sound is becoming social. It is no longer just a reaction to the world. It is part of a relationship between people. This is enormous, because it means that humans are beginning to think about each other, not just about the environment. A person might hesitate before making a sound, not because of the world, but because of how others might respond. This hesitation is the seed of self-awareness. To hesitate is to consider yourself as an object in someone else's mind. This is a turning point. Before, humans were immersed in experience. Now they were beginning to step back from it. A small gap had opened between feeling and expression. In that gap, identity began to grow. A human could think in a non-verbal way, if I make this sound, they will react. This is not yet a sentence, but it is a relationship. The mind is beginning to model other minds. This modeling is what makes language possible, because language is at its core a way of placing something inside another person's mind. Sound was slowly becoming that bridge. As the ability to model others improved, sound became more refined. Different tones were used for different people. A softer hum for a child, a sharper call for an adult, a certain rhythm for a close companion. Sound was becoming personal, and with personalization came meaning. A tone could now mean not just danger or safety, but my danger or your safety. The world was becoming more layered, and with layers came complexity. Children born into this world absorbed these patterns effortlessly. Their brains were shaped by the rich soundscape around them. They learned not just which sounds meant what, but who they came from and how they were usually used. This created the first forms of social knowledge: who could be trusted, who was gentle, who was quick to alarm, all without words, but all deeply felt. The inner sound world continued to grow. A child might hear a soothing hum even when no one was there, not as a hallucination, but as a remembered comfort. This internal comfort could calm them. They did not need another person to make the sound anymore. The mind could make it itself. This was the beginning of self-soothing, and with self-soothing came emotional regulation. A human could now feel fear and then soften it with an inner echo of safety. This made survival easier, but it also made the inner world richer. Soon, a person could feel two things at once: the danger outside and the calm inside. This complexity was new. It required the brain to hold multiple states simultaneously. And this ability would one day allow humans to hold entire narratives in their minds, but for now it was just a quiet harmony of tones. The mind was becoming an orchestra, different sounds, different feelings, all playing together, yet still no words. Objects in the world were not named. A tree was not tree. It was a pattern of sight, smell, and touch. Water was not water. It was coolness, movement, and reflection. But something subtle was beginning to change. Certain sounds were being used when certain things appeared, not to name them but to draw attention to them. A particular sound might be made when food was found, another when a familiar shelter was approached. These sounds were not labels, they were invitations: come, look, gather. But over time, the association between the sound and the thing became stronger. The sound began to feel connected to the object, not in the way words are, but in a looser, more emotional way. This was the earliest form of reference. Sound was starting to point. Pointing is the first step toward naming, and naming is the doorway to language, but this doorway was still only cracked open. Most of human life remained silent, still guided by body, by emotion, by shared rhythm. Yet beneath that silence the mind was changing, growing, layer by layer. As sound grew more intentional, the world itself began to feel different. Not because the landscape changed, but because the human mind was learning to step back from it. To hear a sound and recognize it as meaningful is to create distance. It means something is being interpreted, not just experienced. This subtle distance allowed humans to become observers of their own lives. A cry was no longer just a cry. It was something someone made. A hum was no longer just a vibration. It was something someone offered. In this tiny shift, awareness turned inward. A human might feel a rising tension in their chest and think, not in words but in sensation, that a warning sound should be made. This was not yet conscious planning, but it was no longer pure reflex. Choice had begun, and choice is the heart of language, because to choose a sound is to believe it can change something. Over time, certain sounds became associated not only with situations, but with intentions. A rising tone might mean I have seen something. A softer tone might mean I am here. These meanings were not precise, but they were shared enough to coordinate, shared enough to shape group behavior. As these shared meanings stabilized, humans began to experience a new kind of memory, not just memory of places and feelings, but memory of interactions. Who made which sound, how others responded, what happened next. These memories formed the earliest social narratives, not stories told aloud, but patterns remembered inside. A human could remember being comforted by a certain hum or being startled by a certain cry. These memories influenced future behavior. Trust grew, caution grew. The mind was learning that relationships have patterns. This is the soil in which language would take root, because language is not just about things, it is about people. As relationships grew more complex, sound followed. New variations appeared, subtle shifts in tone and rhythm. A sound could now mean come here in one context and stay away in another, depending on who made it and how. This ambiguity required even more mental processing. The brain had to pay attention not just to sound, but to the speaker, to facial expression, to posture, to timing. Meaning was no longer simple, and complexity demands structure. To handle this growing complexity, the human brain began to categorize sounds, not consciously but instinctively. This one is sharp. This one is soft, this one is long, this one is short. Each category carried emotional weight. Sharp meant alert, soft meant safe, long meant wait, short meant act. These categories were not yet words, but they were becoming building blocks, like stones laid out for a future road. Children born into this world absorbed these categories deeply. Their brains were shaped to detect tiny differences in tone. They became sensitive to nuance. A slight change in pitch could change meaning. This made early humans remarkably attuned to each other. They could feel shifts in mood that modern humans often miss. Because without words, everything had to be felt. This deep sensitivity made social life both rich and fragile. A misunderstanding could ripple through the group. A tone meant to comfort could be heard as threat. There was no way to clarify, no way to explain, only more sound. And so sound became even more refined, more careful, more expressive. It had to carry everything that words would one day carry: emotion, intention, relationship, context. This pressure shaped the voice itself. Human vocal cords became more flexible. Breath control improved. The range of tones expanded. The body was evolving to meet the needs of the mind, and the mind was evolving to meet the needs of the group. Together, they were building the machinery of language. Inside the mind, the inner soundscape was growing louder, more detailed. A human could now rehearse a sound before making it. They could feel how it might land. This was the beginning of imagination as we know it, not just imagining sights, but imagining interactions, imagining how others would respond. This is a profound shift. It means that humans were no longer just living their lives, they were beginning to envision them. The future was becoming something that could be felt ahead of time. This allowed for more careful behavior, more cooperation, more strategy. Yet it also brought more anxiety, because the future could now go wrong, and fear of what might happen is more powerful than fear of what is happening. This fear was not verbalized, it was felt as a tension in the chest, an unease in the gut, an echo of warning sounds remembered. The inner world was becoming emotionally complex, but this complexity made humans more adaptable. They could avoid dangers that had not yet appeared. They could seek comfort before distress overwhelmed them. Sound was their guide. Slowly, something else began to happen. Some sounds started to stick more closely to certain things. A particular tone might often be made when food was shared, another when water was found. Over time, these sounds began to feel connected to those things, not as labels, but as emotional anchors. Food felt different when accompanied by a certain sound. Water felt different when another tone was used. The world was becoming colored by sound. Objects were no longer just seen and touched. They were heard. This multisensory web made memory stronger. A place remembered was not just an image. It was a collection of tones, smells, and feelings. A person remembered was not just a face, it was a voice. Even without words, identity was forming, and with identity came attachment. A human might miss the sound of a particular other. This is the beginning of longing, not for a thing, but for a presence. Language would one day give shape to this longing, but for now it remained a quiet ache. Felt not named, as the web of sound and memory thickened, humans began to feel more separated from the natural world, not in reality but in experience. Before, the wind was just wind. Now it might sound like a warning or like a hum. The world itself began to feel as if it were speaking. This gave rise to the first glimmers of meaning in nature, not gods, not spirits, just resonance. The world seemed to echo human feeling. This deepened the sense of connection. And also the sense of mystery. Humans were beginning to live in a world that was not just physical, but symbolic. Sound had opened that door, and yet true language was still far away. There were no names, no grammar, no stories, only an ever-growing dance of tone, rhythm, memory, and feeling, a dance that was slowly teaching the human mind how to speak. As sound continued to shape thought, something subtle but irreversible took place inside the human mind. For the first time, experience began to separate into layers. There was the raw world, light, movement, temperature, hunger, fatigue. And then there was the felt meaning of that world carried by sound, memory, and expectation. This second layer did not replace the first. It floated above it like a faint mist. A human no longer simply encountered a place. They arrived already feeling something about it. A river was no longer just moving water. It carried echoes of gathering sounds, warning tones, and calming hums. The body responded before the mind knew why. This is when the past began to reach into the present. Memory was no longer passive, it became active. A sound remembered could shape how a place was entered. A tone recalled could influence how another person was approached. The world was becoming interpreted, and interpretation is the quiet foundation of language. Inside the mind, remembered sounds began to organize themselves. They did not float randomly anymore. They clustered. Certain tones were linked to safety, others to urgency, others to closeness or separation. These clusters formed emotional categories, not ideas, not concepts, but patterns of feeling. When a new situation arose, the mind searched these patterns for guidance. It did not ask questions, it matched shapes. This matching is what allowed humans to generalize. A new predator did not need to be known, it only needed to resemble something dangerous. A new place did not need to be explored fully, it only needed to feel similar to a remembered threat or refuge. Sound played a key role in this process. A tone could activate an entire emotional category. One sharp sound could awaken the whole memory of danger. This made sound extraordinarily powerful. It could move the body before thought, and because sound could move the body, it became something to control. Humans began to notice, not consciously, but through experience, that certain sounds reliably caused certain reactions. This knowledge lived in the body. A person might feel the impulse to make a sound and suppress it, or choose a different one. This is the beginning of deliberate communication. The first time a human chose not to make a sound was as important as the first time they did. Silence became meaningful, not just absence, but restraint. Silence could signal calm, it could signal caution. It could signal attention. In a world growing dense with sound and meaning, silence stood out. The mind began to notice the difference. This awareness deepened inner experience. A human could feel the urge to vocalize and hold it back. That holding back created space. In that space, something new appeared, reflection, not verbal reflection, but a pause between impulse and action. This pause allowed multiple possibilities to exist at once. Make the sound, do not make the sound. Wait, choice expanded. And with expanded choice came responsibility. If a sound caused panic when none was needed, the group suffered. If silence caused danger when warning was needed, the group suffered. The individual began to feel the weight of their actions on others. This weight is the beginning of morality, not rules, not laws, but felt consequence. Sound carried social responsibility. This responsibility pushed sound to become more precise, less emotional noise, more intentional signal. Over long stretches of time, certain sounds stabilized. They were made the same way in the same situations again and again. The group came to rely on them. A shared expectation formed. If this sound is made, this happens. This expectation is a contract, not spoken, but felt. The first social contracts were not agreements of words, but agreements of sound. Children learned these contracts early. They learned that some sounds demanded immediate attention. Others could be ignored. Others meant comfort was coming. Their brains wired around these expectations. The human nervous system became tuned not just to the environment, but to social signal. This tuning made humans deeply social creatures, more than before, more than any ancestor, because now survival depended not only on strength or speed, but on interpretation, on listening. As this dependence grew, the cost of misunderstanding grew with it. Misunderstanding could now be deadly, a missed warning, a misread call, a delayed response. This pressure pushed communication to become clearer, not louder, not more frequent, clearer. The voice began to slow in certain situations. Pitch changed deliberately. Rhythm was adjusted. Sound was sculpted, and sculpting requires awareness. The mind was learning to monitor itself. A human might notice how their sound affected others and adjust next time. This feedback loop is learning that happens inside the mind. This is the ancestor of teaching. Before, teaching was demonstration. Now it was signaling, not explaining how to do something, but guiding attention. A sound could draw others to a place, another could warn them away. Action followed sound. This allowed knowledge to move faster than bodies. A human could know something they had not yet seen. This expanded the group's effective awareness. More eyes, more ears, more minds. The group became a single sensing organism, bound together by sound. Inside this organism, individual minds continued to grow more complex. The inner soundscape now included imagined responses. A human might feel how a sound would land before making it. They could sense approval or disapproval. This internal simulation deepened self-awareness. The self was no longer just a body acting in the world. It was a source of signals, signals that mattered, signals that shaped others. This realization subtly changed how humans experienced themselves. They began to feel like agents, not controllers of the world, but participants in a shared process. Language would later crystallize this feeling, but even now the foundation was being laid. The mind could represent itself as a cause. This is enormous, because to see yourself as a cause is to imagine effects, and imagining effects is the beginning of intention. Not instinctive intention, but reflective intention. A human could intend to calm, to warn, to gather. This intention did not yet take the form of sentences, but it existed. An intention seeks expression. Sound was its medium. Over time, sounds grew more differentiated. Small variations carried big differences. A slightly longer tone, a slightly higher pitch. These differences mattered. The brain became exquisitely sensitive to them. This sensitivity allowed humans to communicate more without increasing volume or effort. Efficiency grew. Efficiency always signals evolution. The human vocal tract, the auditory system, and the brain were co-evolving. Each shaped the other. As communication grew more efficient, it freed mental space. Less effort was needed to coordinate. More attention could be given to environment, memory, and imagination. The inner world expanded. Humans began to replay interactions not just as sound, but as sequences. This sound happened, then that response followed, then something else occurred. The mind was beginning to organize experience temporally. This is the birth of narrative structure, not stories told aloud but sequences remembered internally, a chain of cause and effect. If this, then that. This ability made humans more strategic. They could anticipate not just immediate reactions but unfolding events. This anticipation was still emotional, still intuitive, but it was growing more complex. The world was no longer a series of moments. It was becoming a flow. A flow that could be influenced, and influence is the promise language holds. Yet still there were no words, no symbols detached from sound, no naming, just an increasingly rich web of tones, memories, expectations, and inner echoes. The silence of the ancient world was gone, but the noise of language had not yet arrived. Humans stood in between, listening, anticipating, choosing. As the future became something the human mind could feel, the present took on a new quality. Moments were no longer isolated. They leaned forward into what might come next. A sound made now could echo into later moments. A silence held now could shape what followed. This gave time a direction, not a clock, not a calendar, but a flow. Humans were beginning to sense themselves moving through something larger than the now. This sense did not arise from words, it arose from patterns. A warning sound remembered meant danger might come. A calming hum remembered meant safety might return. The mind began to feel the shape of the future. This changed how humans experienced risk. Before, danger was something that appeared. Now danger could be anticipated. This anticipation allowed for planning, not in sentences, not in lists, but in imagined sequences of sound and action. A human might imagine making a warning sound and others moving. They could feel the result before it happened. This inner rehearsal made coordination smoother. The group became more effective. As effectiveness grew, survival improved. This success reinforced the use of sound. Sound was no longer optional, it was essential, and what is essential becomes sacred, not in a religious sense, but in an emotional one. Certain sounds came to feel powerful. They could save lives, they could bring help, they could prevent harm. Humans began to treat these sounds with respect. A warning sound was not made lightly. A gathering call was not ignored. These sounds had weight. Weight in a world that had never known words. This weight gave sound a special place in human experience. It was no longer just noise. It was something that mattered, and what matters becomes part of identity. A person might be known by how they sounded, a strong, clear warning voice, a soft, soothing hum. Without names, voice became a signature. This deepened social bonds. To hear a familiar sound was to feel a familiar presence. This is how early forms of recognition developed. Not by sight alone, but by sound. The brain became wired to identify individuals by voice. This ability strengthened relationships. It allowed for more complex cooperation. A group could now respond differently depending on who called. This was the first step toward roles, not formal roles but tendencies. Some individuals were more often the warners, others more often the calmers, others the gatherers. These tendencies were not chosen. They emerged from personality, experience, and trust. But they shaped the group. Sound became the way these tendencies expressed themselves. The group's social structure was being built in tone and rhythm. Inside individual minds, the sense of self grew stronger. A person could feel that they were the one who made a certain sound, that others responded to them. This feedback created a subtle feeling of importance, not ego but agency. I can do something, others react. This feeling is the root of selfhood. Without language, selfhood was still vague. But it was forming, and as selfhood formed, so did comparison. A human might notice that their sound was answered differently than another's. This created the earliest forms of social awareness, not jealousy, not pride, just noticing. The mind was becoming aware of itself as part of a network. This network was woven of sound. The inner world continued to grow more detailed. A human could now remember not just sounds, but how others had responded. These memories guided future behavior. If a sound had brought help before, it was used again. If it had caused confusion, it was avoided. This is learning based on social feedback. This type of learning is what allows culture to exist, because culture is not just shared behavior, it is shared expectation. And expectation was now being carried by sound. As expectation grew, so did the possibility of disappointment. A sound might not bring the response it once did. This created emotional complexity. A human could feel something like frustration, not named, not analyzed, but felt as tension. This tension pushed communication to adapt. New sounds might be tried, old ones adjusted, the system evolved. Inside this evolving system, something extraordinary began to happen. Some sounds began to detach from immediate emotion. They were no longer just expressions of feeling, they became tools. A sound could be made even when the feeling was not present. A calming hum could be offered without calm. A warning cry could be made without fear. This detachment is critical because it means sound was becoming symbolic, not fully symbolic, but starting to be. A sound no longer had to reflect the speaker's state, it could reflect their intention. Intention to change someone else's state. This is the birth of communication as we know it. Sound was no longer just a mirror, it was a lever. This changed how humans related to truth. Before, a sound always matched feeling. Now it could be used strategically. This introduced the possibility of deception, not deliberate lying but misalignment. A human could make a warning sound to gather others even if no danger was present. This might be useful or harmful. The group had to learn to navigate this new complexity. Trust became more important, who made which sounds and how often they were accurate. This social memory deepened. The mind was now tracking not just events but reliability. This is the foundation of reputation. Without words, reputation lived in remembered sound patterns. A person's history was carried in the echoes of their voice. This made social life rich and delicate. Every sound mattered. Inside the mind, these social patterns were being organized, not as stories but as emotional maps. This person is safe. This one is uncertain. This one is strong. These maps guided interaction. They were the first social concepts. Language would one day name them, but now they were only felt. As the inner maps grew more complex, so did the inner sense of time. A human could remember not just what happened, but how it changed. This person used to warn often, now they do not. This place used to be safe, now it feels different. The world was becoming dynamic. This required constant updating. The mind was busy, busier than it had ever been, and this busyness began to press against the limits of sound. There was so much to track, so much to remember. Sound alone was no longer enough. Something more was needed, something that could hold complexity. This pressure is what would eventually give rise to words, but that moment had not yet arrived. For now, humans lived in a rich, humming world of tone, memory, expectation, and social meaning, a world just on the edge of speech. In the quiet tension between sound and meaning, the human mind reached for something new, not because it wanted to, not because it knew what it was missing, but because the world it had built was becoming too rich for silence alone. There were too many memories, too many relationships, too many imagined futures. Sound could signal, but it could not describe. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, humans began to feel the limits of what sound alone could carry. A warning tone could say danger, but it could not say where. A gathering hum could say come, but it could not say why. This gap between what was felt and what could be shared began to widen. Inside each mind, experience was becoming more detailed than what could be expressed. This created a quiet pressure, a longing to be understood more completely. This longing is one of the deepest roots of language. Before there were words, there was the ache of being unable to share everything inside. Imagine a human seeing a distant fire, not a campfire, a wildfire. The body fills with alarm. A warning cry is made. Others become alert, but the sound cannot carry the image. It cannot carry the size of the fire, the direction of the wind, the urgency. The others must see it themselves to know. This limitation cost time, and time is everything. The mind began to feel this cost, not consciously but as tension, a frustration that sound could not do more. This frustration pushed experimentation. Humans began to vary sounds more. They added length, they added repetition, they added rhythm. A warning might be made longer, then repeated, then followed by another sound. Not a sentence, but a sequence. Sequence is the first form of structure. Structure is the first step toward grammar. These sound sequences began to carry more information, not precisely, but more. A long warning followed by a short one might mean something different than a single cry. The group began to learn these differences. Slowly, a small vocabulary of sequences emerged, not of words, of patterns. Each pattern had a rough meaning: danger near, danger far, come now, come later, still vague. Still emotional, but more detailed than before. The mind was building a bridge. Inside the mind, the inner soundscape grew more organized. Echoes were no longer just tones, they were sequences. A remembered pattern could replay. This allowed the mind to hold more information. It could simulate not just a sound, but a chain of sounds. This chain could represent a sequence of events. This is how the mind began to think in steps, not in sentences, but in flows. If this happens, then that, then this. The brain was learning to model reality. Language would later formalize this ability, but for now it was happening silently. As sound sequences became more stable, they began to detach further from immediate emotion. A sequence could be used even when the feeling was not present. This made communication more flexible, and flexibility is a hallmark of language. A human could now warn about a danger they remembered, not just one they saw. Memory could be shared, not fully, but partially. This was revolutionary. The past could now influence the present of others. Experience could be transmitted, not just through demonstration, but through sound. This meant that knowledge could travel faster than bodies. A human could know something they had never seen. This expanded the group's collective mind. The group became something larger than the sum of its individuals. This is the beginning of culture. Culture is shared memory. Sound sequences were becoming the vessels of that memory, but they were still fragile. A pattern could be misunderstood, forgotten, altered, meaning drifted. This made communication unreliable. The mind began to crave stability, something that would hold meaning more firmly. This craving is the pressure that shapes language. Humans began to repeat certain sequences more often. Repetition makes things stick. A pattern used often becomes familiar. Familiar becomes expected. Expected becomes reliable. Reliable becomes meaningful. This process slowly solidified the sound patterns. Children learned them as part of growing up. They did not know they were learning anything special. They were just absorbing the soundscape of their group, but this soundscape was becoming structured, more like a system, less like noise. Inside the brain, neurons were wiring to these patterns. The auditory cortex became specialized. The brain was adapting to a world where sound carried complex information. This adaptation would eventually allow for words, but words were still far away. For now, humans lived in a world of proto-language, a world where sound could suggest but not explain, where meaning was shared but not precise. Yet even this was enough to change humanity forever. The mind was no longer trapped inside the skull. It could reach out, touch another mind, alter another's behavior. This connection created new possibilities. Cooperation became deeper. Hunting became more coordinated. Danger became more manageable. Group became more than just a collection of bodies. It became a shared consciousness, bound together by sound. Inside this shared consciousness, individuality still grew. Each person had their own inner echoes, their own memories, their own imagined futures. Language would one day allow these inner worlds to be compared, but for now they existed side by side, mostly unshared. This created a quiet loneliness, a sense that something inside could not be fully expressed. This loneliness is ancient, older than words. It is the loneliness of having a mind, and it is what drives us to speak. But at this point in our story, humans could not yet speak. They could only hum, cry, warn, and call. They could only share fragments of what they knew. The great leap was coming, but it had not yet arrived. The human mind was standing at the edge of language, feeling its shape, feeling its absence. The threshold of language is a strange place. It is not a moment. It is not a sudden invention. It is a slow crossing made of countless small steps no one ever noticed. Humans did not wake up one morning and begin to speak. They drifted into speech the way a river drifts into the sea, sound by sound, pattern by pattern. At this point in our story, humans had built a rich world of tone, rhythm, memory, and social meaning. They could warn, they could call, they could soothe, they could even share fragments of memory, but something essential was still missing. They could not describe. They could not point to an absent thing and bring it into another's mind. They could not say, "The fire is over there," or "The animal went that way," or "This place is safe." They could only try to make others feel what they felt. This limitation shaped everything. It made communication deeply emotional but shallow in detail. It kept minds close but understanding narrow. The first cracks in this limitation appeared when certain sounds became consistently associated with certain objects or places. Not as names, but as emotional tags. A particular tone might be made whenever a certain fruit was eaten. Another when a familiar shelter was approached. Over time, these tones began to feel connected to those things, not in a logical way, but in a sensory, emotional way. The fruit did not just taste a certain way, it sounded a certain way. The shelter did not just feel safe, it was accompanied by a familiar tone. This created a new kind of memory. A human could remember the sound and feel the thing. The sound had become a doorway. This was the first step toward symbolic thought. A symbol is something that stands for something else. These sounds were not yet symbols, but they were becoming close. They were no longer just reactions, they were references. This allowed humans to evoke things that were not present. A person could make the food tone and others would feel hunger. They might look around, they might move. The thing itself was not there, but its shadow was. This shadow was carried by sound. The mind was learning that reality could be represented. This is the heart of language. As this ability grew, humans began to play with it. They made sounds not just when things happened, but to make things happen. A person might make the food tone to encourage sharing, or the shelter tone to call the group home. These sounds were becoming tools for shaping behavior. This made social life more complex. People could now influence others in more subtle ways. This required even more mental tracking. Made which sounds, when, with what result? The mind became a network of expectations. This network demanded structure. Without structure, it became chaotic, so sound patterns became more stable. They were repeated the same way in the same context. Children learned them by imitation. Over time, the group's sound system became consistent, not fixed, but recognizable. This is what a language is in its earliest form, not grammar, not vocabulary, but shared patterns of sound and meaning. Inside the brain, this consistency allowed for new kinds of thinking. A human could now combine sound patterns, not just one but two in a row. This allowed for more complex messages. Food plus here, danger plus far. These were not sentences, but they were composites. They carried more information. The mind was beginning to layer meaning. Layering is the beginning of syntax. Syntax is the structure that allows small pieces to build larger ones. This ability did not appear suddenly. It grew slowly as sound patterns became more reliable. As they became more reliable, the brain trusted them. As the brain trusted them, it used them more. This feedback loop accelerated. Communication became richer. Richer communication made social life more complex. Complex social life required even better communication. The spiral continued. Inside the mind, inner sound sequences became more elaborate. A human could imagine not just a single tone, but a string of them. These strings could represent sequences of events. This allowed for planning, not explicit planning, but intuitive anticipation. A human might feel how a hunt would unfold, not as a story, but as a pattern of sounds and actions. This made cooperation more efficient. Groups could coordinate more tightly. They could surround prey. They could warn of danger. They could share resources. This efficiency gave humans an enormous advantage. Language was not just about expression, it was about survival. But even as communication improved, it remained deeply tied to emotion. Sound still carried feeling. A warning was not just information, it was fear. A gathering call was not just instruction, it was warmth. This emotional grounding kept early language human. It was not abstract, it was alive. As sound sequences became more complex, the inner world became richer. Humans could now replay interactions in more detail. They could feel regret, anticipation, relief. These feelings were tied to imagined sound patterns. The mind was becoming a theater. Scenes played out silently, not in words but in sensations and echoes. This is the ancestor of imagination, and imagination is what allows language to go beyond the present. A human could now imagine something that had not happened. They could feel a warning before danger existed. They could feel a reunion before someone arrived. This made them more proactive, but it also made them more anxious. The future could now disappoint. This emotional complexity is a price we pay for language, but it is also what makes us human. At this stage, humans were speaking in everything but name. They had communication, they had shared meaning, they had inner representation. What they did not yet have was stable symbols. They did not yet have words that meant the same thing every time. Their sound patterns were still fluid, still tied to context, still open to interpretation. This kept language from fully emerging, but the pressure was building. The world was too complex. The mind was too full. Something had to give. Soon, very soon, a sound would detach from its emotional roots. It would become a symbol. And once that happened, nothing would ever be the same. But that moment is not yet here. For now, humanity stands in a humming world of proto-language, able to feel, able to share, able to anticipate, but still unable to truly speak. The last quiet before words is not truly quiet. It is filled with breath, with tone, with rhythm. It is filled with minds leaning toward one another, trying to share more than sound alone can hold. At this point in human history, something remarkable was happening inside the brain. Neural circuits that had evolved to process sound, emotion, and memory were beginning to overlap. What had once been separate, hearing, feeling, remembering, was now becoming integrated. A sound could trigger a memory. A memory could trigger a feeling. A feeling could trigger a sound. This loop allowed meaning to circulate. The brain was no longer a collection of reflexes. It was becoming a system of representations. Representations are internal stand-ins for the world. They allow something to be present without being physically there. This is the mental space where language lives. But before language could take root, one more transformation had to occur. Sounds had to become independent of the situations that created them. They had to become portable. A warning sound could no longer belong only to danger. It had to belong to the idea of danger. This shift is subtle but profound. It means that sound stops being just an echo of the world and starts becoming a symbol for it. Somewhere, sometime, a human made a sound not because danger was present, but because danger was remembered. others reacted. The sound had done its job. The brain noticed this worked. This realization did not happen in words. It happened as reinforcement. A pattern was formed, sound plus memory, right arrow response. This pattern allowed humans to share what they knew, not just what they saw. The past had become communicable. And when the past becomes communicable, history begins. Not written history, not spoken history, but lived history, shared experience across time. This was a turning point. From here on, humans were no longer bound by their own senses alone. They could inherit knowledge, not through genes, not through instinct, but through sound. This inheritance made each new generation smarter than the last because they did not have to rediscover everything. They could be told. In the beginning, they were told through tones and patterns. Later, they would be told through words, but the principle was the same. Sound had become a vessel for knowledge. As this vessel grew stronger, the human brain adapted. Regions involved in memory, emotion, and sound became more connected. The brain began to treat sound as something meaningful, not just something to react to. This increased the brain's capacity to process complex sequences. The groundwork for grammar was being laid. Grammar is the rule system that allows sounds to combine in predictable ways. These rules were not explicit, they were felt. A certain sequence sounded right, another sounded wrong. This intuitive sense guided communication. Children absorbed it naturally. They imitated what they heard. They did not know they were learning a system, but they were. This is how all language is learned, not by instruction but by immersion. As proto-language became more structured, humans began to experience a new kind of thought. They could think about things that were not present, not just in fleeting flashes but in sustained inner experience. A human could sit by a fire and imagine a hunt. They could feel the warning sounds, the gathering calls. The moment of capture, this mental simulation allowed them to prepare. Preparation increased success. Success reinforced simulation. The mind became more future-oriented. This orientation made humans less reactive and more strategic. They were no longer only animals responding to the world. They were becoming planners, but planning requires stable symbols. To plan, you must hold something in mind, something that does not change. Sound patterns were becoming more stable, but they were still fragile. Meaning could drift. A sound might mean one thing today and another tomorrow. This instability limited how far planning could go. The brain began to crave fixed reference points. This craving is what would eventually create words. Words are sounds whose meanings are fixed by social agreement, but before words there were proto-symbols. A particular sound might almost always be made for a particular thing. Over time, that sound became strongly associated with that thing. The association grew. Eventually, the sound could bring the thing to mind even when it was not present. At that point, a word was almost born, but not yet, because a true word is not just a sound associated with an object. It is a sound that everyone in the group agrees on. Agreement is the key, and agreement requires stability. This stability was slowly forming. Generations of repetition hardened the associations. The sound for food became more reliable. The sound for water became more consistent. The sound for danger became more specific. The group began to expect these sounds. Children learned them early. They became part of the social fabric. The proto-language was becoming a language. Inside the mind, this stability allowed for new kinds of thought. A human could now recall a sound and feel confident about what it meant. This confidence allowed the mind to manipulate symbols, not just feel them. This is the beginning of abstraction. Abstraction is the ability to think about something without needing to experience it directly. It is what allows science, art, and storytelling to exist, but it begins here, with a sound that means something, a sound that does not have to be heard to be real. The inner world was becoming a place of symbols, not yet words, but something close. Humans were now living in two worlds, the physical world of bodies and landscapes, and the mental world of sounds and meanings. These worlds were intertwined, one influenced the other. This is what makes humans unique. We do not just live in reality, we live in our understanding of reality. That understanding was being built out of sound. As this understanding grew, so did the possibility of misunderstanding. Two people might use the same sound differently. This created confusion. The group had to negotiate meaning, not through discussion but through use. If a sound caused the wrong response, it was adjusted. Over time, consensus formed. This consensus is what makes language possible. Language is not something one person creates, it is something a group agrees on. This agreement was forming, slowly, silently, relentlessly. The first true words were almost ready. They had not yet been spoken, but the human mind was now prepared to hear them. Before the first true word was ever spoken, there was a long moment of uncertainty. A moment where sound was almost ready to become something more. Humans had built a dense network of tones, rhythms, and patterns that carried meaning. They could warn, they could call, they could remember. But to create a word is to do something different. A word is not just a sound that feels right. It is a sound that stands for something even when that thing is not present. A word is a promise between minds. It says, when I make this sound, you will think of this thing. That promise had not yet been fully made, but it was about to be. Somewhere, sometime, a sound was repeated so often in the presence of a particular thing that the two became inseparable. The sound did not just accompany the thing, it evoked it. A human could hear the sound and feel the thing appear in their mind. This was new. The thing could now be present without being physically there. This is the birth of representation. When representation is shared, language exists. The first words were likely simple. Not nouns like tree or water, but things closer to actions and needs. Come, go, danger, food. These meanings were not sharp, they were fuzzy, but they were shared. The group knew what the sound usually meant, and that was enough. Once this happened, the human mind changed forever, because a word does not just carry meaning, it carries potential. A word can be combined with another word. Two representations can be held at once. This allows for more complex thought. A human could think food plus there. This is the beginning of sentences, not spoken yet, but imagined. The mind was now capable of holding multiple symbols at once. This allowed for more detailed planning, more precise communication, more sophisticated social life. The group could now coordinate in ways never before possible. They could say danger plus far, they could say come plus later. These combinations were not yet grammar, but they were steps toward it. Inside the brain, new neural pathways were forming. Paths that linked sound, meaning, and intention. These paths allowed for symbolic thought. The human mind was becoming something new, a mind that could refer to things. This changed how humans experienced reality. Before, everything was immediate. Now something could exist in the mind even when it was not there. The mind could wander, imagine, remember, plan. This created a richer inner world. It also created a new kind of suffering. A human could now think about what they did not have. They could think about someone who was gone. They could think about dangers that might never come. This is the price of representation, but it is also its power. The first words did not arrive in a flood. They arrived one by one, slowly. A sound becomes a symbol becomes a word. Each word adds a new tool to the human mind. With each tool, the world becomes more describable, more shareable, more knowable. Over generations, the vocabulary grew. More sounds were stabilized, more meanings were agreed upon. The proto-language became a true language, still simple, still emotional, but capable of representing the world. This allowed humans to create something entirely new, stories not told yet in the way we tell them now, but sequences of symbols. A human could think danger plus there plus yesterday. They could remember an event. They could share it. The past became portable. This changed how humans understood time. Time was no longer just a cycle, it became a line with a before and after. This allowed for learning on a new scale. A group could avoid a place because of something that happened long ago, not because of instinct, but because of a story. This is how culture truly began. Culture is memory shared across generations. Words made that possible. And yet, even as words began to emerge, much of the old silent world remained. Humans still felt deeply. They still communicated with tone and rhythm. Words were layered on top of that ancient foundation. This is why language still carries emotion, why tone still matters, why silence can still speak. The silent world never left us, it is still inside us. Beneath our words, our bodies still hum with the old music. The first humans to speak did not know they were changing the world. They were simply trying to share what was inside, to bridge the gap between minds. That gap had been growing since the first inner echoes formed. Words were the bridge, a fragile, powerful bridge, and once it existed, it could not be undone. Humanity would never be silent again, not inside, not outside, but the memory of that silence remains deep in our nervous systems, in the way we respond to tone, in the way we feel before we think, in the way we long to be understood. That longing began when sound first reached for meaning, long before the first word was spoken. Even after the first words were born, the world did not suddenly become loud. Speech did not arrive like a storm. It crept in slowly, woven gently into the fabric of silence. For a long time, humans spoke only when they had to. Most of life was still lived the old way, through gesture, tone, shared rhythm, and instinct. Words were rare, precious, used only when sound alone was not enough. This is important to understand. Language did not replace silence, it grew inside it. The earliest words were not used to tell stories or share ideas. They were used to point, to warn, to call, to ask. They were extensions of the ancient tones that had already existed. A warning cry might now include a distinct sound that meant predator. A gathering hum might now include a sound that meant home. These sounds were still wrapped in emotion. They still carried fear, warmth, urgency. But now they also carried reference. They could point to something beyond the failing. This allowed humans to coordinate more precisely, to say not just danger, but danger there. Not just come, but come here. This precision changed everything. The group could move more intelligently. They could plan routes, avoid hazards, share discoveries. The environment became more navigable, not just with the body, but with the mind. Words allowed humans to map the world inside their heads, not in images alone, but in symbols. These symbols could be arranged, rearranged, combined. This made thinking more flexible. A human could think about a place they had never been. They could think about a hunt that had not yet happened. They could imagine. Imagination was no longer limited to flashes. It became a space, a place where ideas could be explored. This changed how humans experienced themselves. Before, the self was mostly a body in the world. Now the self was also a mind with a story made of symbols. This story could stretch into the past and future. It could include others, it could include dreams. This is when identity as we know it began, not just being, but being someone. Words allowed humans to describe themselves, even if only in simple ways. This is me, that is you. These distinctions were new. They allowed for deeper relationships, but also for deeper conflicts, because when you can name yourself, you can defend yourself. And when you can name another, you can judge them. Language brought clarity. It also brought division. But even as words took root, the ancient sound world remained. Tone still mattered. Emotion still guided meaning. A word spoken softly meant something different than the same word spoken sharply. This layering of sound and symbol made language rich. It also made it complex. Understanding someone now required listening to both what they said and how they said it. This duality is still with us. It is why a single sentence can carry many meanings. It is why silence can still speak louder than words. As language slowly spread through human groups, it changed how knowledge was shared. Skills could be described, not just shown. A person could say something like sharp stone and another would know what to look for. This made learning faster. Children could acquire skills without direct demonstration. This accelerated cultural evolution. Each generation could build on the last. This compounding of knowledge is what allowed humans to transform the world. But at this stage, language was still simple. Words were few. Sentences were short. Most meaning was still carried by context and tone. Yet even this was enough to unlock a new kind of mind. A mind that could think about thinking. A mind that could reflect. A human could now say something like, "I am afraid," not just feel fear. This allowed fear to be shared, to be discussed, to be soothed. This changed emotional life. Feelings were no longer locked inside. They could be named. Naming gives distance. Distance allows choice. This is the beginning of emotional control. But it is also the beginning of emotional complexity. Because once you can name a failing, you can think about it. And once you think about it, it can grow. Language made emotion deeper, more layered, more human. The silent world was simple. The speaking world was rich, but richness comes with weight. Humans began to carry stories. Stories of what happened, stories of who did what, stories of what might come. These stories shaped behavior. They created expectations. They created fears and hopes. The mind became crowded with words, with images, with imagined futures. This crowding is what we now call thought. It is beautiful, it is exhausting, and it began here, in the gentle merging of sound and symbol. As generations passed, language became more structured. Grammar emerged, not taught, not invented, but discovered. Certain ways of combining words felt right, others felt wrong. This intuition was shaped by shared use. This is how all languages form, not by rules, but by habit. The human brain is a pattern-seeking machine. It found patterns in speech. It reinforced them. This made communication more efficient, more expressive, more powerful. With grammar, humans could express relationships between things, not just food and here, but food is here. Not just danger and far, but danger is far. This allowed for precise information. The world became more predictable, more understandable, but also more controllable. Humans could now coordinate on a scale never before possible. They could plan hunts days in advance. They could organize groups. They could transmit complex ideas. This gave them dominance over their environment, and dominance changes how a species sees itself. Humans began to feel separate from nature, not just part of it, but able to shape it. This feeling would grow over time, but its seed was planted here, in the first sentences, and yet beneath all this, the ancient silence remained. In moments of rest, in moments of awe, in moments of grief, words would fail, and humans would fall back into the old ways, breathing together, humming, being, because before language there was connection, and that connection never disappeared. It only gained a new layer. As words slowly took their place in human life, the mind began to transform in ways no one could have predicted. Language did not simply give humans a way to communicate. It gave them a way to think. Before words, thoughts were made of sensations, images, and emotional echoes. After words, thoughts could be shaped, refined, and held in place. A feeling could now be named, an idea could now be formed. This allowed the human mind to become more precise, but precision also brought separation. A named thing feels different from an unnamed one. When you name something, you draw a boundary around it. You make it an object. Language turned the flowing world into a collection of things: tree, water, sky, self. These labels allowed humans to manipulate the world mentally, to move pieces around inside their minds. This is what makes problem solving possible, but it also changed how humans experienced reality. The world was no longer just what was, it was what could be described, and description filters experience. This created a subtle distance between humans and the world they lived in. Before language, a forest was a presence. After language, it was also an idea. This allowed humans to think about forests, but it also meant they were no longer simply inside them. They stood apart. This distance is the root of self-awareness, and self-awareness is the root of both creativity and suffering. With language, humans began to think about themselves as objects. I am this, I am that. These statements were not just descriptions. They were stories, stories about who someone was. These stories could change, they could be argued, they could be defended. Identity became something constructed, not just lived. This changed social life. Humans began to define themselves and others through words. This allowed for more complex relationships, but also for misunderstanding. A word could be taken the wrong way. A sentence could wound. The emotional power of language grew because words were no longer just signals. They were representations of inner worlds. To speak was to reveal something inside. This made communication both intimate and risky. As language developed, humans began to tell stories, not just sequences of events, but narratives with meaning. Stories allowed humans to make sense of the world, to explain why things happened, to pass on lessons. This made culture deeper, but stories also shaped perception. A story about danger could make a place feel dangerous even when it was safe. A story about a person could define how they were seen. Stories have power. They can create reality. This is one of the great gifts and dangers of language. The silent world did not have stories, it had experience. The speaking world has both, and sometimes they conflict. As generations passed, language grew more abstract. Humans began to talk not just about things, but about ideas, justice, beauty, time. These concepts did not exist in the silent world. They required symbols. They required words. This allowed humans to think beyond the physical, to imagine invisible things. This is where religion, philosophy, and science would eventually grow. But even in these early times, the seeds were planted. A human could now wonder, not just feel. Wondering is a form of thought that requires language, because to wonder is to ask. Questions were born. Why is the sky like this? Why did they leave? Why did that happen? Questions open the mind. They create curiosity. They drive exploration, but they also create uncertainty. The silent world was certain. Things were what they were. The speaking world is full of unknowns. This uncertainty can be frightening. It can also be exhilarating. Humans began to live in a world of possibilities. Language created the future, not the physical future, but the imagined one. A human could think about what might happen. They could plan, they could worry, they could hope. This made life richer, but it also made it heavier. The weight of thought grew. The mind was no longer a simple mirror of the present. It was a landscape of memory and expectation. This is what we now call consciousness, not just being aware, but being aware of being aware. Language made that possible, and yet even as words filled the mind, the ancient silence remained beneath. In moments of deep emotion, words would fall away. Grief, love, awe, these experiences still lived in the old world of sensation and sound. Language could point to them, but not fully capture them. This is why humans still hum, still cry, still sigh. The body remembers the time before words. It speaks in ways older than speech. This is the quiet truth of our nature. We are not just creatures of language. We are creatures of silence who learn to speak, and that silence is still inside us, waiting, in the pause between words, in the breath before a sentence, in the moment when we feel something we cannot describe. That is where the ancient human still lives. Even after language had fully entered human life, it did not replace what came before. It layered itself on top of something far older. Beneath every sentence, beneath every word, the ancient human still listened for tone, for rhythm, for breath. The brain never forgot the world before language, and because of that, humans became beings of two realities. One reality was made of symbols, stories, and descriptions. The other was made of sensations, emotions, and presence. These two worlds do not always agree. A person might say they are calm while their body trembles. They might speak of love while their voice carries fear. We still live with this tension. It is the inheritance of our silent past. Language allowed humans to think about their feelings, but it also allowed them to hide them. This is something no animal before us could do. We could say one thing and feel another. This gave us power. It also gave us conflict. As language grew more complex, humans began to use it not just to share, but to influence. A story could inspire, it could deceive. Control, this was new. Sound had once been honest, it matched the body. Words could lie. This created a new moral landscape. Truth and falsehood became possible. Before language, a cry was a cry. Now a word could be a mask. This made trust fragile, but it also made choice meaningful, because now how you used language mattered. You could harm or heal with your voice. This responsibility shaped human societies. Rules emerged, not just rules of behavior, but rules of speech. What could be said? What could not? These rules formed the backbone of culture. As language became more powerful, it began to shape reality itself. Humans no longer just responded to the world, they described it, and what we describe becomes what we see. A mountain becomes a boundary. A river becomes a border, a person becomes an enemy. Words carve the world into pieces. These pieces can be used, but they can also divide. The silent world had no borders, it had only landscapes. Language brought maps. Maps bring control, control brings power. Human societies grew around shared stories, stories about who they were, where they came from, what mattered. These stories gave people identity. They also created outsiders. The simple, quiet world of early humans became a complex web of meaning, a web held together by words. And yet, inside each person, the ancient silence still lived. It lived in the way we feel music, in the way a look can say more than a sentence, in the way we sometimes sit together without speaking. These moments are echoes of a time when we did not need words, when presence was enough. We still crave that presence, we still seek it, in love, in nature, in stillness. Language made us powerful, but it also made us restless. The mind that can name everything is never fully satisfied. It always wants more, more understanding, more explanation. The silent mind was content. The speaking mind is curious. Curiosity drives progress. It also drives longing. This longing is what makes us human. It began when the first sound tried to carry more meaning than it could hold. It continues every time we struggle to express what we feel. We are always reaching across the gap between inner and outer worlds. Language is the bridge, but it is not perfect. Sometimes the deepest truths remain unspoken, felt only in the body, in the breath, in the quiet. This is where the story of language meets the story of silence. They are not enemies. They are partners. One gives us thought, the other gives us peace, and both live inside us. The human who had no language never truly disappeared. They became the part of us that listens, the part that feels, the part that knows without words. When you close your eyes and simply exist, you return to that ancient place. The place before names, before stories, before the mind began to chatter. That place is still home. In the deep quiet that still lives inside every human, the ancient world remains. It waits beneath the language we speak, beneath the stories we tell ourselves, beneath the endless flow of thought. This silent place is not empty, it is full of knowing. Long before words, humans knew when to stay close. They knew when to flee. They knew when someone was hurting. They knew through the body. That knowledge has never left us. Even now, when someone walks into a room, we feel their mood before they say a word. We sense tension. We sense warmth. These are echoes of the time before language. We are still animals of perception. Language only added a layer. It did not erase what came before. As language grew, humans began to live more and more in the world of symbols. We began to think about life instead of simply living it. We began to describe ourselves instead of just being. This created a gap between experience and interpretation. In that gap, anxiety was born because the mind could now imagine what was not happening. It could worry, it could regret, it could hope. These are powerful forces. They have driven human civilization, but they also distance us from the present. The silent human lived only now. The speaking human lives in many times at once. Past, future, possibility. This makes us extraordinary. It also makes us tired. Sometimes the mind longs to return to the quiet, to the simple awareness of being. That longing is not nostalgia. It is memory, a memory older than language, a memory of what it was like to be human before words. When life was not narrated, when experience did not need to be explained, we still find this state in moments of deep focus, when listening to music, when watching the ocean, when sitting beside someone we love. In those moments, words fall away. We become present. We return to the ancient mind. This is why silence feels healing. It is not the absence of something. It is the return of something. The return of a way of being that sustained humanity for hundreds of thousands of years. A way of being that is still part of us. Understanding this changes how we see ourselves. We are not broken because we sometimes cannot express what we feel. We are remembering something deeper. We are remembering that not everything needs to be said. The first humans lived entire lives without words. They loved, they grieved, they survived. They were not less than us. They were different. They lived in a world of direct connection. We live in a world of representation. Both have their gifts. Both have their costs. When we struggle to communicate, we are feeling the tension between these two worlds, the world of the body and the world of the mind. Language bridges them, but it never fully unites them. This is why art exists. Music, painting, dance. These are attempts to speak without words, to return to the ancient language of feeling. They remind us that communication does not require sentences. It requires presence. When we listen deeply, we are using the oldest part of ourselves. The part that existed before language. That part knows when someone is sincere. It knows when something is wrong. It knows when something is beautiful. No explanation needed. This is why a single look can sometimes say more than 1,000 words. The silent world still speaks, just not in sentences. As we move through our modern lives, surrounded by constant noise and information, we rarely visit this quiet place. But it is always there, waiting, when we breathe slowly, when we close our eyes. When we let go of thinking, we step back into it. We become, for a moment, the humans we once were, the humans who lived without language, the humans who felt the world directly. This is not going backward, it is remembering forward, bringing balance to a mind that has grown too loud. Words gave us civilization. Silence gives us peace. We need both. We always have. Silence is not something humans lost when we learned to speak. It is something we carry with us quietly all the time. Every pause between words, every breath, every moment when we feel more than we can explain. These spaces are the old world. They are where the first humans still live inside us. When you sit alone at night, listening to the hum of the world, you are closer to them than you might realize. The mind may be full of thoughts, but beneath them there is still a listening presence. That presence does not use language. It does not judge. It simply notices. This was the original human consciousness. Not a voice in the head, but a field of awareness. As language grew, that field became crowded. Thoughts began to fill it, stories, plans, worries, but the field itself never disappeared. It is the space in which all thoughts appear. This is why meditation feels like a return not to something new but to something ancient, to a time when the mind was not constantly narrating itself, before the inner voice took over. The inner voice is a product of language. It is how we think in words. But it is not the only way to think. Before words, humans thought in images, sensations, and feelings. We still do. Dreams are proof of that. In dreams, language often fades. We experience directly emotion, movement, presence. The dreaming mind is closer to the ancient mind. It speaks the old language of the body and the senses. This is why dreams feel so real. They bypass the filters of language. They show us what it is like to experience without commentary. The first humans lived in that state all the time. They were awake inside a dream-like awareness, not because they were confused, but because their minds were not filled with words. This made their experience vivid, raw, immediate. Modern humans have gained clarity. We can analyze, we can plan, we can reason, but we have lost some of that vividness, some of that immediacy. We see the world through labels instead of just seeing. We hear the word bird instead of the flutter of wings. We hear wind instead of the breath of the sky. Language gives us understanding, but it also places a veil over direct experience. This veil is thin, but it is always there. To lift it even briefly is to return to the ancient mind, to feel the world as it is, not as it is described. This is why moments of awe feel so powerful. When you look at the stars, or stand at the edge of the ocean, or hold a newborn child, words often fall away. You are left with feeling, with presence, with something that cannot be reduced to language. This is the old human. This is the part of us that existed long before the first word was spoken. It is the part that knows without explaining. As language reshaped the human brain, it gave us incredible abilities. We can build, we can teach, we can imagine futures that do not yet exist, but it also created an inner noise, a constant stream of thought. That noise can be useful. It can also be exhausting. Many of the struggles of modern life come from this inner noise, from the mind telling stories about what we are, what we should be, what might happen. These stories can trap us. They can make us anxious. They can make us feel separate from the world. The silent human did not have these problems. They did not worry about the future. They did not replay the past. They lived in the flow of what was happening. This does not mean their lives were easy. They faced hunger, danger, loss. But they did not carry those experiences as stories. They carried them as sensations. They moved on when the moment passed. Modern humans often cannot. We keep reliving moments through language. This can deepen suffering, but it can also deepen meaning. We can learn from the past. We can plan for the future. This is the trade-off. Language gives us power. Silence gives us peace. The challenge of being human is learning when to use each, when to think, when to simply be. The ancient world had no words, but it had wisdom, a wisdom rooted in the body, in the senses, in the rhythms of nature. We can still access that wisdom by listening, by slowing down, by paying attention. When we stop filling every moment with speech, we allow the old awareness to surface. This is not something we need to learn, it is something we need to remember. It has always been with us, beneath every thought, beneath every word, a quiet, watching presence. The same presence that watched the sun rise tens of thousands of years ago. The same presence that felt the wind on bare skin. The same presence that listened to the first hums around ancient fires. We are still those humans. We have simply added a voice on top, and sometimes it is good to let that voice rest. In the final quiet of this long journey, we return to where we began, to the human before words, to the mind that listened before it spoke. After everything we have explored, the birth of sound, the rise of meaning, the slow forming of language, and the world of thought that followed, one truth remains gently waiting beneath it all. We are still those ancient humans. Every heartbeat, every breath, every subtle feeling that moves through your body right now is older than language. Before there were names, before there were stories, before there was a voice in the mind narrating your life, there was simply awareness. A quiet presence open to the world. That presence has never left you. Even now, as you listen to these words, there is a part of you that is not listening to language at all. It is simply listening. To tone, to rhythm, to silence between sounds. That part is ancient. It remembers what it was like to live without labels, without explanation, without the need to be anything other than what you are. The first humans did not know who they were in words, but they knew who they were in feeling. They did not describe the world, they belonged to it. And in some quiet way, so do you. When you walk in nature and feel calm for no clear reason, when music moves you beyond thought, when a single look from someone you love speaks more than 1,000 sentences, you are touching that old world again. The world before language, the world where connection came before meaning. Language gave us civilization. It gave us memory and knowledge and the ability to pass ideas across generations. But silence gave us something just as precious. It gave us presence, it gave us the ability to feel deeply, to know without explaining, to exist without needing to justify ourselves. We carry both worlds inside us now, the speaking mind and the listening mind, the one that plans and the one that simply is. The modern world is loud, full of words, full of stories, full of endless thinking, but inside you the ancient quiet is still there, waiting. And when you slow down, when you breathe, when you let go of the need to describe everything, you return to something very old, very gentle, and very real. A place where being human was simple. A place where humans had no language and yet somehow understood everything. If this story helped you relax, reflect, or drift into a peaceful place, take a moment now to gently support this channel. Subscribe for more quiet history and soothing stories. Leave a comment and tell us where in the world you're listening from. Wherever you are tonight, thank you for being here and for sharing this quiet moment with us.